And it really is an honor and a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Rob Breen came to the New York State GIS Advisory Council meeting, and he gave a fantastic presentation, which led to a fantastic discussion about geospatial data as it relates to climate change. I promised at that meeting to help amplify Rob's message by bringing him to this audience and bring his message to a national stage. And it's kind of interesting, you know, if Rob is focused on protecting New Yorkers and managing climate in New York, that works well for managing climate in Wisconsin or any place else in the world. It's one of these things we're all in together. So Rob is the head of the New York State Office of Climate Change, and he has a PhD in environmental policy, and he's really putting that to great work. So I'm really, really pleased to have Rob join us, and we'll fire up a discussion. This will be a keynote presentation. Will take about an hour, and then we'll have a second presentation afterward that Rob has also agreed to join us that really breaks into a discussion that we can collectively come together and start to shape how we're going to organize to really address something that on our own feels daunting. Together as an army of brilliant people with a great willingness to help, it's way less daunting. So that's kind of my feeling, my theme for today. So with that, you ready to go, Rob?
I'm ready to go.
All right, we'll turn this camera off and we'll let you have at it. Thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Frank. My name is Rob Breen, and I am with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in the Office of Climate Change. Although to clarify, Frank, I lead up the adaptation section for the Office of Climate Change, which means my primary responsibilities are to deal with the issues of adaptation and resilience when we don't meet our climate change greenhouse gas mitigation goals, reducing our carbon outputs, then some amount of that is going to be baked into the system, and we'll have to adapt over time. Now, I know some of you are very well versed on climate change language, but I'll make sure as much as possible I can clarify as I go throughout this morning. So first of all, thank you for this opportunity to be here, and welcome all of you this morning. I hope you had a great breakfast and a great Valentine's Day last night, although that may have disrupted a lot of relationships last night. So hopefully there's some good phone calls and you're not in the doghouses for too long if you were away. But I want to start off with the two disclaimers. First of all, the comments that I make today are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the policy of New York State, nor the Office of Climate Change, nor the Department of Environmental Conservation, and I always need to do that. I do like to talk about important things and just wanted to clarify that. And the second I wanted a disclaimer is that I am not a GIS professional, but I'm rather a user of GIS tools frequently, almost daily, and I'm a GISophile or something like that. So I will not get into technical pieces today. That's probably good for you while you're eating your breakfast. But I want to get into some bigger picture things about the role of GIS. So let me begin with a story. There was this monkey that was walking alongside a river. He was stopping every few feet on a branch and then jumping into the water, and he was grabbing a fish. And then he took the fish and he put it in a nearby tree. Well, the monkey was asked what he was doing. And he said, "I'm very, very busy doing very important work. Yesterday, I came along here and I saw the problem with the fishes. And I made a map by marking the beach with sticks wherever I saw the fish swimming by, so I'd know where to find them today. And I came back today so I could use my map so I could save the fishes from drowning." Now, having good intentions is not adequate. Like the monkey, you can have all the great intentions you want, but decisions also have to be grounded in scientific reality. And we have to understand what's going on and what needs to be done, and making sure that we don't just do frivolous actions to keep ourselves busy. So let me give you an overview for this morning. In my world of climate change policy, I'm always accused of being the person who walks into the room as the gloom and doom guy, hence the title of the talk today. But I take this, what I call a gloom and bloom approach. And this is how I inform my climate policy. And I'll share that with you. So here's the gloom. There's no way that we can look at the assessment reports and the special reports that are coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and most recently the AR6, and including there's a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. We can't look at the US Global Change Research Program, the National Climate Assessment for the United States, and NCA number 4, which came out a couple years ago. New one's coming out, by the way, next year. We can't look at the reports of what happened and what didn't happen at the UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow just a few months ago. We can't do that. And also take a look at our policy and look at how federal and state policy leaders are jumping onto the bandwagon and doing some efforts, but at the rate that we are doing this, mobilizing to do this, there's no way that we can actually spin this in an honest way and make things look rosy for you. So that's the gloom. That's the honesty. That's the science. That's what we have to deal with. That's our challenge. Environmental, social, and climate change problems, they all intersect. And we humans, we Homo sapiens are not naturally built for this kind of problem solving. That's the gloom. But we do have some signs of hope, and that's the bloom. Nature actually has an incredible innate capacity for healing and regeneration, and will and can work for us, with us, if we unleash some of those restrictions that we put on her. We have some incredible new science and social science knowledge that can help us right now that we've never had before, we've never been able to tap in before. And we can activate our natural human capacities for collaboration and tool making. And I want to emphasize that tool making. I'll get into that in just a bit. So we already have some technological tools, including especially GIS tools, which we use throughout everything that we do in climate change policy. And we have this to help us. So that is the bloom. We're at the threshold of a new realm of problem solving, and we need to decide together how we're going to use our new enhanced human capabilities in the face of a very rapidly changing world where we start off and it doesn't look anything beyond some gloom. So this morning, we're going to look at the gloom. I'm going to present a little bit of that climate change as a threat multiplier, which makes our current socioeconomic and environmental problems that much worse. We're going to walk through the current status of climate change impacts and how GIS tools are already being used to address some of those problems and challenges. And then we're going to switch over and look at the brighter side, the hope, the bloom. We're going to explore some of the very interesting insights from the social sciences that can help us in addressing climate disruption. And I say climate disruption because it sounds so much nicer to say it's warming, especially in a cold winter. And if you walked outside this morning, maybe you're experiencing a little bit of that. So climate disruption can work for us too. We will identify some key challenges, some strategic pathways, and then some thoughts and insights. And maybe this will be the piece that will really kind of inspire some conversation afterwards. And then for how we're going to use the GIS tools that will help our generation and future generations to address the challenges. So let's go ahead and let's jump in, begin with some good old-fashioned, sobering climate change gloom, just to start your morning off. All right, so as I said, climate change is a threat multiplier. We already have these pre-existing conditions, socioeconomic and environmental threats and challenges, and climate change is basically exacerbating everything that's going on, these pre-existing threats. We are already using GIS tools to understand some of these current major socioeconomic threats and challenges. We have poverty, crime, and inadequate affordable housing. We have unemployment, inflation, and supply chain disruption. Particularly, you read the headlines today, these are jumping out. We have increased food insecurity as a result of some of those things I just mentioned. So that's an increased risk to the food supply and food shortages. These are already ongoing. We have decreased access to clean, safe drinking water. We have increasing human populations and the corresponding consumption rates, the demand for land and consumption of products that are drawn from the natural resources. And of course, we have the COVID pandemic and other epidemics. And, who knows, maybe the next, move of where COVID is going. We have a volatile fossil fuel energy system and costs, and we're seeing that at the gas pumps. We have migration and immigration of human populations in response to all those issues. We have also, right at this time, creative political gerrymandering of voting districts. So even if we have some democratic processes in place, there are forces that are, one could argue, a little bit less democratic than we would hope in making sure that people are able to have representatives that represent their ideas and their interests. We have military conflicts, including military buildups along national borders, and that is sitting on us heavy today. We have trends of political illiteracy and non-participation, even in democracies. We have trends of ecological literacy and climate illiteracy, especially misconceptions of the science of climate change. And then just all over, we have increasing complexity of life, society, government. It makes it very, very difficult for us to pull all those pieces together, get up in the morning, drink our coffee, move on, and make a difference in the world. This is some gloom stuff. And this would have existed without climate change, without climate change pushing a thumb on this and adding to this. But GIS tools are actually helping us to identify all those issues, where the geospatially located, trends, futures. GIS is also being used to understand our current major ecological threats and challenges, although all the ones that I just shared also have ecological elements too. We have toxic spills and brownfields and all other types of pollution, especially harmful chemicals in our ecosystems. We have forest cover lost through deforestation and western wildfires. We have a loss of soil, which doesn't seem all that strange, except that that's our source of food, how we get our food on our tables. We have threatened species, habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity. All of these contribute to the quality of life for humans and other species. We have the ocean and freshwater fisheries collapses constantly. We go out and fish for all of our needs, for food needs and other extractive needs. And we overfish to the point where fish stocks collapse. And then we move on to the next bigger fish. And then when that collapses, we move on to the next bigger fish. And we have a history of doing that. And we just have, in general, natural disasters. And by the way, nature doing its thing is not necessarily a disaster, but when it's in the way of human communities, we dub them as natural disasters. So there's floods, wildfires, hurricanes, heat waves. Again, all of these things are things that would have happened without climate change, but at a much less impactful scale. But these kind of lay the foundation. And then climate change is the threat multiplier. It multiplies those existing threats. And then GIS is also being used to understand the latest climate change threats. And here we go with the long list of what we've added on by adding climate change or climate disruption as a force in the world. So it's already happening. It's causing increased problems all over the globe. And keep in mind that we've only reached an average of 1.1 degrees Celsius change. And these are the results of what's happening. And if it helps to think also about that, a 1.1 degrees Celsius change means we take the entire planet Earth and we pump so much of the sun's heat energy into that we can crank up the temperature of the entire planet on average 1.1 degrees Celsius. I don't know if you've ever tried to, on a cold morning and your heat doesn't kick on, and you opened your oven and see if you can heat your entire house by opening your oven door, but that's a lot of oven power to heat up just one house. And we've got climate change that's actually pulling in enough heat to heat up the planet Earth by 1.1 degrees Celsius. So we have sea level rise that's causing and will cause flooding, loss of coastal land where people are living right now, a large percentage of the human population living along coastal areas under threat of sea level rise. The introduction then of salt water into the drinking water supplies and into agricultural fields in those areas. We have ocean acidification, which, although we have to clarify, it doesn't make the ocean acid, it's already base. It's just making it a lot less base and moves along the acidity scale. But by doing that, it results in a further collapse of fisheries and supplies, the food supply chain for millions. And that'll accelerate even more with climate dioxide, for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is sequestered in the deep ocean. We have extinction of species and migration of species under climate change, and that's accelerating ecosystem collapse. It's the loss of pollinators, bees, which also decreases our food supplies and spreads disease. We have increased storms, And by the way, we have what's called attribution science, which can go back and look at what percentage, if we had these incidents that were unfolding without climate change, we have the ability to use attribution science to show what percentage of these have been exacerbated by climate change. So we have these increased storms, natural disasters, and movement of precipitation, picking up rain and snow where it wasn't before and dropping it, or dropping it in increased rates. It's causing floods in some areas, droughts in others, collapse of agricultural systems and food supplies in other areas. And particularly in those areas where they need snowpack throughout the year to provide certainly snow recreation. We see that going on in China right now, and the need to manufacture snow in those areas, but also, and more importantly, in those areas that rely on that snow cap to melt and provide drinking water throughout the year. Those are going away. We have heat waves, the loss of or the scorching of crops on those days where it gets so serious that the crops fail, or cows are not able to make it, or particularly humans in urban areas. And it's the #1 killer of natural disasters of humans is heat waves. You would think it's floods. I did until we did the research with GIS. We have infrastructure damage. Heat and floods will increase damage to roads, railroad tracks, bridges, buildings, homes, drinking water pipes, sewer pipes. In our area in here, we have a city that has a lot of our pipes underground, as most cities do. But when the ground freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, it used to just freeze and stay frozen for weeks and weeks and weeks. And now it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, and all that disruption disrupts the pipes underneath the ground. And so on days where it gets a little bit above freezing, we have pipes that will burst, and then the very next day it drops down to 0 or 5 below, and then you have to have teams out there at 5 below digging up ground, some of it frozen soil, to repair these pipes so that people have drinking water during the winter. We have large demographic changes, migration of peoples who are environmental refugees, conflict over access to natural resources and political control. There's a lot. GIS has identified those climate change threats and challenges, and these are all coming together. So climate change is also a threat, as you can imagine, to governance and democracy. Individual consumer actions are inadequate for addressing these. While we tell people to do all the things they can do to reduce their carbon budget, it doesn't happen by having 30 people on a street make a low carbon lifestyle. We need to transform our communities with collective action, with public policies at every level of human governance. And we do this by public policies, and we use GIS to inform that. So here's some of the climate change policy challenges. So if we're going to put in place policies that affect everybody, that encourage all institutions at every level to make these commitments to reducing our carbon emissions and then also to adapting, we've got to put in place effective climate change policies. According to multiple analyses, the commitments of the COP26 in November, and of course this is the gathering, the international gathering of all the governments to make these commitments to reduce carbon emissions. In November, they came together, and it was mixed, good and bad. However, the analyses show that the current policies, the commitments that governments are making, will lead to a best estimate of around 2.6 to 2.7 degrees Celsius change by 2100, by the end of the century, with an uncertainty range, and this is just the uncertainty of our science, anywhere from 2 degrees Celsius at the lowest to up to 3.6 degree Celsius change. Now that's with the existing policies that are in place. That's not inspiring. Now, if countries meet both their conditional, unconditional obligations, their commitments for the near-term target, the projected warming will fall to 2.4 degrees Celsius, or the range of, again, of uncertainty, 1.8 degrees to 3.3 degrees Celsius. And then finally, if countries meet their long-term net zero promises, if they meet them, global warming would be reduced to around 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2100, in a range of about 1.4 to 2.6. So there's, again, some uncertainty in every commitment that we make. However, the current policy of the world right now of 2.6 to 2.7 degrees warming that's the track that we're on right now, is still one with potentially catastrophic impacts on human and natural systems. If we're
Pardon me,
doing all
Rob.
that we can do. Yes.
I don't know if you're intending to share slides.
No.
Okay,
Nope.
good. Thank you.
And that's
All
as much data as I'm going to unload.
No, that's great. It's going wonderfully. I just didn't want to be disappointing. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. So we've got some challenges here. Climate change is still abstract to many. We don't see the local effects. Oftentimes, we don't understand the science. Warming sounds too nice to people in cold climates. It's perceived to be far in the future. We talk about the 2100 goals. That's far for people, and they're not even going to be here. You know, culturally, Americans tend to see things as a balance between two sides. You know, we have the economy versus the environment, and we balance those. And we look at climate change, we say, yeah, we need to do a little bit, but not go crazy, because we still have to have a fossil fuel-based economy. We have other policy issues that appear to be more concrete. They're immediate, they're understandable, and they become higher priorities than climate change. In the United States, politicians respond to the concerns of their constituents. And so because of the lack of understanding of the public, they don't put a lot of pressure on their politicians to make good policies. People, as we know, we just resist change. And we find it hard to accept any new knowledge that contradicts what we already believe, what we already know. And we know that humans are not terribly rational. We would like to think that we are, even those of us who are well trained in science and using tools like GIS and using of data to make decisions. We still make decisions that are non-rational based on our values and our stories that we believe to be true. Just recently, actually last week, the US Army released a report to identify how climate change will exacerbate the social unrest throughout the world, and it may lead to national security threats in the United States. And then additional military conflicts. And the military is very concerned that if they're not prepared for climate disruption and climate disrupts their operations, they will not be able to defend national security in the United States. And the media has not been very effective in presenting the science of climate change. The tendency has been to present it as a conflict between two perspectives. And they always want to give voice to those that really just don't have much science to support them, or any science at all. And we move to somewhere in the balanced middle. So we've got these challenges. Here's some key uncertainties. And I just gave you kind of some range of uncertainties, even with the climate projections here. So the details on how and when climate disruption will unleash, we're not certain about that, when that's going to happen, or the degree to which that's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We just not sure exactly when and exactly how. How well we'll be able to mobilize and transform society via public policy and collective action. We're not certain about how we're going to be able to do that, how well we'll be effective in doing that. And then how the Earth is going to respond, and will humans be able to continue to thrive on the planet? So let me go ahead and jump into a bloom pathway. That's a lot of gloom in the morning. And I hope you're still able to digest your food, but this is the stuff that a lot of folks who are doing climate change work have to deal with on a daily basis, and those who are paying attention to what's going on. But we also pay attention to the real positive things that are going on, and this is the bloom pathway. We have some tremendous tools, some knowledge, some technologies, and capabilities that are available to us to help us to successfully transition toward this carbon and low carbon and sustainable society that we need. That will be both resilient and have increased adaptive capacity. And since GIS is inherently an interdisciplinary field, it includes many human dimensions. It's not just the data that we collect or the technological tools that we use, it's how humans interface with this fantastic technology that we use in so many ways. So let's take a look at some relatively recent discoveries and insights from the social sciences in particular. Come from anthropology, behavioral studies, neurocognition, and these shed some light on human behavior about what we are capable of being and doing if we focus on those aspects. So we know that the human brain of Homo sapiens sapiens, us, we're not designed for obscure threats, for really complex, unpredictable problems, what we sometimes call wicked problems that don't seem to have a pathway toward a solution. Or for the scientific decision-making based on rational thought and on logic. We don't have brains that were designed for that, or that we are fit for that. Evolution has evolved all our cognitive abilities. And We're least human, we know, when we are in fear. The deepest part of our most primitive brain that gets activated in fear also activates defensiveness and threat by other groups. And we're particularly vulnerable if we're led by a demagogue or a dark, what they call in psychology, a dark triad has three particularly nasty traits of personality, makes them both charming and devious. And if we follow a common story that's detached from the science of scientific reality and nature, if we have that, we are vulnerable, and particularly when we are working out of our fear, defensiveness, and our threats. So what we are best adapted for, best fit for as Homo sapiens, as a species, is we are actually fit for survival and adaptation in nature as a collaborative small group of people, probably village living, doing gardening, some tool making, and peaceful cooperation under normal times. That's actually what humans were doing for the longest of time, and we evolved under those conditions. We are ultimately the supreme adapters on the planet Earth. Of all the species, we have more tools that allow us to survive and thrive and to adapt in all kinds of conditions. We're the only species that can live in every single condition on the planet Earth. Even going off the planet, we can actually live in space and on the moon because of our ability to adapt. We are the supreme adapters. That's very heartwarming and very much a Bloom thing. We use abstract thinking. We have the ability to think abstractly. That's the basis for a language, and it's our ability to conceive of the future and to imagine and to dream and to come up with innovations for tools that don't yet exist. So that abstract thinking has become a tremendous adaptation for humans and a tremendous potential for us to use. We are also ultra social. We are more social than just about any other species. We work collaboratively, even with strangers, and then we specialize within the group and offer that specialization to others so that other humans benefit. People we don't even know. When we're making a new technology and sharing it, we're not even aware of how other people are actually using that to improve lives and their situations. But we're radically social. That also means that we take the shape of our containers. Like milk, depending on our container, humans are deeply influenced by that. Our worldview and our narratives, oftentimes for childhood or from our culture or from our immediate social groups, those change us for the good or bad. By the way, if they're in a bad place, we're telling a bad story, it's not so good for us. But if we are careful about shaping that container, science-based, tell a good story, we can shape human behavior. And we're not exclusively hyper-individualist, selfish, or competitive. There's a lot that's out there that says, gee, by nature, humans are selfish. Well, we have that ability if it's called out from us, but we are by nature deeply collaborative. We evolved to do collaborative behaviors. We know that we have the power to use games and stories to model the world, to practice it and imagine it. So games and stories, we're deeply hardwired for games and stories as ways to model the world. And then we can communicate and transmit knowledge rapidly among our peers from generation to generation even. So we found that there's some species of monkeys, some chimpanzees, bonobos, who are able to come up with some innovations, but they can't pass it on from generation to generation. So they continue after generation to generation doing the same crazy things that don't allow them to survive, but we can actually pass that on. Every human society, by the way, that we've been able to find out has some kind of a left and right, a progressive, a conservative element, and they've always been able to work together for the best of what humans can do. And keep in mind, we're very polarized here, but because we have these conservative and progressive elements in all human societies throughout history, we have an extraordinary capacity for taking the both and actually cooperating. So these are some real positives here. And note that we are able to call upon what makes us most human. Particularly in times when we're under threat. And one of the most important things, and this is what I want to lead into now, is our ability as human beings, as Homo sapiens sapiens, to use tools, to use our abstract thinking, our models of the future, and to put it together with what our hands are able to do and our collaborative conversations are able to do, to use tools to extend our senses and then our capabilities for decision making. So the use of tools. And today's GIS tools are expanding our ability to see. And when I say see, I want to put that in quotes. They expand our ability to see our world and our future. And by using these together, it takes advantage of our collaborative capacities as human beings to develop and use these tools in extraordinary ways. And using GIS and GIS tools is a deeply human endeavor that's deeply rooted in what it means to be human and deeply rooted in our capabilities and our best capabilities that will allow us to survive and thrive as a species. I can imagine early on, we started with using just sharpened stones, and at some point thinking, I have an imagination as a cave person, and someday I'm going to use a GIS tool that will allow me to map my way out of this cave into some beautiful place where I can build a city. Maybe it's a little far-fetched, but nonetheless, you get my point here. And so GIS is a very powerful potential for the use of tools for human solutioning, problem solving. So how are we already using GIS tools in climate change work? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of those problems we've already identified using climate change tools, but already GIS features use tools for climate change adaptation and mitigation. If you know the difference, mitigation is what we usually refer to as reducing our carbon emissions. And what we need to do to make sure that climate change, although some of it's already here and baked into the system, that it doesn't go crazy over time and by 2100 for future generations, our kids and our grandchildren. But GIS tools also focus on adaptation. So that's the amount of change that we're already having and we're going to have baked into the system that allows us to adapt and change to those climate changes. So international, national, and state climate assessments. These are all in the impacts, they're all visualized using GIS maps. The IPCC 6th assessment report, it actually developed a new interactive atlas, which could only be done obviously with GIS tools. GIS tools are used in climate change in a lot of ways for adaptation and resilience. We use it for weather, for planting, for identifying planting zones in agriculture, for looking at snow cover, melting ice. We use GIS for assessing environmental impacts and for understanding wildlife migrations, where they're moving and where marshes, our wetlands are moving. We also use GIS tools to track human migrations. Where are people moving away from these climate impacted areas, flood zones? We use it to track the spread of the pandemics and epidemics. And yes, these are also deeply rooted in climate change. So we're going to see more and more epidemics and pandemics as a result of climate change. We're using GIS tools to now track sea level rise and those future projections of sea level rise. We're using GIS tools to identify flood risk zones and inland flooding areas and storm surge areas. We're using GIS tools to do disaster impact mapping. We send out drones with GIS capabilities to map this. We're doing vulnerability assessments, determining how agencies or communities are vulnerable to climate change. We're developing infrastructure maps, so we know where these critical infrastructure and assets are located using GIS maps. We're mapping wetlands to calculate how these wetlands can actually give us additional resilience to protect our communities, GIS tools. We're doing ecosystem-based adaptation, where we help nature, ecosystems, give us some adaptive capacities. We're mapping those out and looking at places where if we invested a little bit in those ecosystems, that would give us increased adaptive capacity in the face of climate change impacts. We're even using three-dimensional maps and some with augmented reality, so we can see what a community would look like under climate change, under flooding. And when people put on these tools that are GIS tools with this augmented reality, it creates images that have a way of just really grabbing people and letting them know these are real issues and they can see this. We also use GIS tools to explore future scenarios. What are the potentials of where we're going into the future? And then we do these time-lapse comparisons. Here's the before and after. That sometimes are just really stark, looking at how climate has impacted other places, and particularly want to identify story maps, the power of story maps, where we take these GIS tools, these capabilities, and we attach them to stories that are very deeply meaningful for human communities, and the power of using those to transform the way that people see. And for mitigation tools, we also identify these greenhouse gas targets under particularly natural and working lands. So these are forests and wetlands and agricultural lands. We map those. We're mapping them and modeling them, and we're calculating carbon emissions and sequestration ability and the ability to be carbon sinks, and where we can locate these and expand on these and improve the health of these ecosystems. And then we're also mapping community engagement. Where are the communities that are actually developing climate change plans and climate change targets? All of this that we do, it's so essential that we're using these GIS tools. So here's some thoughts. And these are thoughts and insights really to kind of provoke some conversation. And we'll have this conversation after this presentation. So we are now at the threshold of a new realm of problem solving. And we need to decide together how we are going to use these new enhanced capabilities in the face of a rapidly changing world. Okay? So if we want to keep things exactly as they are, we do a risk assessment and say, what do we need to do to keep things exactly the way they are? Because they're already really, really good. If we assume that, and then we're going to make ourselves resilient to climate change, we have some challenges because we're pretty sure that things cannot be kept exactly as they are. And it's our GIS tools that have allowed us to see, look, when sea level rise comes into our coastal communities, it's going to flood up to this point. And that puts this entire district, our business district, underwater. And if you'll walk with me for a second, we think we're going to put up some seawalls or maybe some sandbags or something. And these buildings are underwater on a regular basis. And we're going to have people coming out of their work at the end of the day. They climb out their window, down a ladder, get into a canoe or some kind of a rowboat. They take their boat out of the flood zone and get to a cab and then go home. And in the morning, they're dressed in the three-piece suits. They grab their briefcase, throw it back into that canoe, paddle over to their office, climb up the ladder, get into their third-story window, maybe take the elevator to the top. We're not going to be living in flood zones. Right. So if we think that we're going to have a planet where we're doing a risk assessment to keep things exactly as the way they are, GIS tools have shown us we can't do that. We can't make the assumption things will stay exactly as they are. So just a thought. If we think about new ways of moving humans and assets and communities out of these areas, we're going to need GIS tools to show where are appropriate places to do some movement. And so there's just a thought to think of. If we're focused on what was broken, and then we reimagine a better system or institution or policy, we can use GIS tools to help us to do that. We should utilize useful technology and avoid frivolous technology. And you know what I mean? When we use technology for helping humans to survive and thrive, or we can take that same technology and use it in a frivolous way. And those are lost opportunity costs to solve some real problems. And we take these highly trained and expert GIS technical people, experts, people who are gathered around listening to this today, and we shift you off to doing frivolous things with technology. We're not best at doing that, and that doesn't help us to solve our problems. So useful technology versus avoiding frivolous uses for technology. And then we need some GIS tools for systems thinking. As I talked about all those different impacts, social, ecological, and climate change impacts, they're all coming together, and we have to find ways to really map out those systems of interactions. And we can use GIS tools to help us to do that, but we have to figure out how to best do that for systems thinking. So plant that seed in you. We know that stories, the human brain is deeply embedded in stories. They've been an effective tool for passing on critical information, for sharing that with other people. They're very powerful. They can grab the heart, load it with emotions, and get us motivated to do the right things if we have the right stories. How do we best use GIS tools in combination with stories, with narratives, to shape the containers of people so we're motivating people in the right directions? GIS data doesn't change people. GIS data doesn't change people. People change people. So how do we have good people using GIS data to help change people where we need to do change? By the way, people resist change. So how do we create a system where people are excited about growing? Growth is change. Change is growth. How do we get them to grow and use GIS data? No GIS data is unbiased or politically neutral. So I want to throw that out. So how do we make sure that when we look at our GIS tools and our data, that we consider the bias that's built into what we select to demonstrate our analysis, what we use to visualize. We're making some decisions, and those reflect our biases. So how do we use GIS data to make sure that we move toward as unbiased or as politically neutral as possible? In times of political or ideological polarization, the questions prevailing for these dominant stories, we need to follow the data. So how do we do this during times of political or ideological polarization? And those are these times. How do we use GIS tools to deal with that polarization? Our climate change strategies must be data-driven, not fear-based ideology-driven. So how do we make sure that our GIS efforts aren't kind of sidetracked down those fear-based ideology tracks? You know, Alexis de Tocqueville, he visited the United States back in the early 1830s, I'm sorry, and he remarked how civic-minded Americans were. Despite tremendous diversity, Americans were able to rise up and meet their own needs. They formed community civic groups of very diverse new Americans as an expression of local democracy. He was fascinated that Americans could do this. You know, participatory GIS can be a means of increasing democracy and, you know, kind of reflecting what Alexis de Tocqueville saw back in 1830 of, you know, kind of reclaiming that American heritage that allows us to do this participation together despite our diversity, our ideological diversity too. GIS is a deeply human endeavor. It helps us to thrive and survive as a species. So how do we use that to survive and thrive? So here's some hopeful and practical pathways for GIS and climate change. Just some thoughts, again, of where we can go into the future. We have more science and social science available than ever before that can guide our decisions. That's very hopeful. We have incredible advances in technology that can help us, particularly in GIS tools that allow us to visualize humans' relationship with the space that we live in. Homo sapiens can collaborate and disseminate to gather, you know, to collect, process, analyze, visualize, and share data, to utilize that, and then to disseminate that widely to inform our decision making. So we have the ability to collaborate and use collaborative GIS tools. That's very promising. Because of our ultra sociality, our ability to work together, social groups, to form groups and move forward, we can use innovation and adaptive management and feedback loops. We're constantly taking in information. It forces us to listen to nature and to respond. So how do we listen to the impacts that we're having on the earth and get those feedback loops, take that information and plug it back into our models and know what we're doing when we have impacts on the earth and on our social systems? With the fact that we can do that is very hopeful. Our planet, the planet Earth, is designed to be very resilient. Life always finds a way. So we can work in concert with that and unshackle, you know, nature and places where we've done that. We need to do some ecological restoration. By the way, all of that's done with, yes, GIS tools. A very hopeful thing, more and more young people are becoming literate and involved, and they're tech savvy. We have the perfect, brilliant storm in the sense of younger people being literate about climate change, about social issues. They're connected globally in ways that my generation was not, and they are aware. Globally, governments, they are mobilizing. Right? They're not mobilizing quickly, but they are mobilizing more and more. So people are waking up to this and realizing the responsibility we have. They are mobilizing to address mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And that's very, very hopeful. We just need to increase the pace. Humans are working together and have proven to be very capable when faced with a major crisis. Crisis seems to bring together people from all ideological bents to come and work together. It brings out the best of who we are. And boy, do we have crises that has the capability of bringing us together, right? How do we harness that? And we do have the ability to mobilize the public if we can get the story right. The story right and the data that's able to grab the human heart and pull out those right emotions, we can mobilize the public with ways of using participatory GIS. So let me share with you another story. This is the story of the 3 little pigs and the big bad hurricane Wolfgang. So the first pig said, you know, this whole climate change stuff, this is a hoax. It's not, even if it weren't, it's It doesn't affect me. It's not relevant. It's somewhere very distant in the future. So that little pig built a straw hut on the beach, a beautiful beach, and watched the sunset over the ocean and really enjoyed life. Then the big bad hurricane Wolfgang came and blew down the house. The second pig used historic trends of flood maps, a very smart pig, built a wood frame cottage 10 feet back on the beach, built a seawall, bought some low-cost flood insurance with deferred balloon payments in the future, and then sat back and watched the sunset over the ocean. A smart pig. But big bad hurricane Wolfgang came and blew down the house. Now the third pig, she downloaded and analyzed GIS data from multiple sources. She got her sister-in-law to create a GIS systems analysis tool to consider the intersection of multiple climate change impacts, to download the current future projected conditions. And then she looked at that and sold her coastal property during the buyout, and then relocated her house out of the coastal flood zone through the safety zone that's going to be safe throughout to 2100. And that maintained her property value for her kids, you know, the future piglets. She rebuilt her new home with sustainable materials that fit the many different future climate conditions. And she built an energy microgrid with battery backup, of course. She shared that GIS data with many other neighbors, told them what she did. She shared that with her neighbors in the community, and they also benefited. And they formed groups and were all able to do that kind of thing. And they formed a community-based organization and advocated for local changes in the climate impact disclosure law so that when real estate was sold, everybody would have the GIS data to know that their house was in a flood zone, a disaster zone, and would not buy those houses, which meant that wasn't happening anymore. And the third little pig ignored the taunting of the other two pigs. That was a little bit of their pig gear pressure that she ignored. And when big bad hurricane Wolfgang came, and it did come with tremendous fury, it blew and it blew, and it brought up such wind and such rain and such storm surge. And she sat in her house with all of her other neighbors and watched it on her GIS screens, and were able to track the storm and know that they were safe from the storm of Wolfgang, Hurricane Wolfgang. So let me give you a summary here. Okay. So the gloom, we've talked about the gloom. There's a lot of really nasty stuff, but these are problems that humans can mobilize against. We need a problem that will bring us together, and we've got these problems. But we also have some bloom and some hope. Homo sapiens are designed to survive in challenging environments. That's how we are. We have evolved to do this. This is what we do well. We are the supreme adapters. And we have the ability to work as a group over multiple generations by constant learning, by innovation, by tool making, sharing of information, especially via vivid stories, by practicing via games, and rapid decision-making for increasing the probability of survival, and using incomplete or uncertain data that we can fill in with our stories and our imagination, as if. We have been pushing the limits of human cooperation and ingenuity to give us some of the most helpful scientific knowledge and social science knowledge and useful digital decision support tools in human history. We have more and better GIS tools and decision support tools than any generation has ever had. And GIS is a useful tool that can help us to extend our senses, that allow us to see climate change in completely new ways and makes it real to people, so we can overcome our inability as Homo sapiens to actually see abstract things. GIS tools can let us see those things and then respond as if it's very practical. And as I said, we're at the threshold of a new realm of problem solving, and we can decide how we're going to work together to use these tools and how we're going to use these new enhanced capabilities in the face of a rapidly changing world. Let us be like the third little pig. Let us bloom where we are planted. Thank you for your time. And I hope you have a great rest of your experience here. I think that Frank, that we can open up to questions and comments at this point, and then ultimately we can lead into the discussion after this.
Wow, Rob, I have a request to everyone in the audience here and online. Can we all turn our cameras on, hit the reaction button, and bring it for Rob? That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Really, really grateful. I am picturing T-shirts that say NSGIC Pig 3. And you'd have to be in the room to know, right? And you just like, that's one of the advantages. Is why you come to NSGIC, to get your NSGIC Pig 3 T-shirt, and we all know what it is. And everybody else goes, huh? And it starts the story, right? I love starting with things that are innately human and moving through to our complexities. And you have given us great challenge and great hope. And guess what? There's no getting off this bus. You're in this room. This is the community. You in? Yeah. All right. Who's got the comments?
So Frank, do we want to start with online first if
Please.
there's anything there?
Jamie, would you monitor things that are in the chat, and would you help us bring our online folks fully into the room?
I sure can, Frank. Thank you. I don't see anything in the chat at this point, but certainly online friends, feel free to come off camera, come off mute, and share your comments and thoughts with the group. And if we want to give them a minute, Frank, we could go to in person if that works for y'all.
That's great. Thank you. I think some of us are speechless, and that will come, right? It's okay.
I do have the email address of that third pig. If anybody wants it, I can put it in the chat box. But
That's great. That's great. And in the room, please remember to say who you are and what state or organization you're from, so we can continue to connect for those that can't see, because the cameras are only facing this way in the room.
You bet. Dr. Breen, this is Richard Wade with the state of Texas. First of all, I wanted to thank you for, this was an amazing presentation, something that we think about, I think, with this group all the time. There was recently a documentary out that was called The Year the Earth Changed. It was a documentary, I think, on Apple. But if you've seen that, it kind of talks about how resilient the Earth really is and how much has changed over the lockdown, the COVID lockdown. Are you able to speak to that a little bit to understand, was there any research done? Seems like that scientists probably would have really looked at the impacts and maybe how quickly the Earth can rebound if we took the proper steps.
I haven't seen that the year the Earth changed, so I can't respond specifically to that, but I absolutely can respond to nature's ability to kind of bounce back. So Richard, thank you for your question. So first of all, one of the things that has come out most recently is we know that when we put out our carbon emissions, the pressure that it puts on the Earth is extraordinary, and more so we're finding, and this is not the positive, that the Earth is very, very sensitive, and the Earth's ecosystems are very sensitive to climate changes. So we thought that the Earth was going to be much more resilient to these climate changes and be able to absorb a lot more and not be impacted, but it's very sensitive to it. So that's actually the negative. The positive, however, and that you reference, is when we lift that change or that impact, we are finding that the Earth is able to respond very effectively. It's almost like by putting all these the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, we're putting on handcuffs, and when we extract those back out, or if we stop those emissions, it takes off the handcuffs and frees the Earth, and it does have an ability to bounce back. But here's what the resilient science is actually telling us, and just something to consider for us and our need for human adaptation, innovation for this. What we think of is that humans or the natural systems will go back and they'll in essence bounce back under resilience to the same way that they had been before. But nature is very smart, And so what it does, it builds in, it basically has a toolbox, an evolutionary toolbox that allows it to rearrange those systems in ways where it can survive under, under an ice age or under times when it was much, much hotter on the Earth, when it was, full of volcanoes really heating up the planet Earth. And we have that legacy, the biological legacy is kind of a genetic backpack that we carry around with us. And so during those times, nature can activate those, and those more adaptive genes can be activated, and then we can evolve and adapt in those systems. But the problem for humans is nature can adapt by creating an ecosystem that we can't survive in. There was a time on the planet where it was loaded with trees and all kinds of plant life, and they produced this really horrible, toxic substance that was killing everything off. It's called oxygen. And then the Earth evolved the capability of life that actually could breathe oxygen, and then so many were generated that the Earth was then put back into balance with oxygen breathers and then carbon dioxide breathers, and we now have this synergy going on. The more that we breathe, the better the trees are. The more they breathe, the better we are. So the concern is that that the Earth and its ecosystems will bounce back, but they'll create a new arrangement that will not be particularly helpful for humans, like giving us good soil or clean water that's good for us to drink, or the things that we need to survive. So we're really concerned about that some changes may be irreversible, and we don't want to take those risks and allow ecosystems to flip.
Frank, we need to move on to our next topic.
Yes, we do. And Rob, one, I would like to apologize for interrupting your flow. You're not using slides. It's refreshing and compelling and innately human. We appreciate that. And also invite you to stay with us, not certainly in the short term through our next 45 minutes or beyond, but stay with us in this community long term, because we really want to help you see out the vision that you have. And I think looking out in this room, looking at the faces, looking online, it gives me hope. So it's serious and hopeful all at the same time. So thanks again.
All right, thanks, Frank.